Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Nada Kraizat, and today um, Minzar was not able to join us. He was sick today, but he did record a video of his presentation. So join me today to talk about Jetpack Compose Tooling. Um, and let me play this video.
Everyone, my name is Minhazur Rahman, and I'll be going over some tooling that we can use to make working in Jetpack Compose a little bit easier for us. There are two main topics that I'll cover in this presentation. One of the topics will be the preview, how to see previews of our Compose layouts and Compose components. And also I'll be going over the layout inspector, which has a bunch of tools and things in there that makes developing in Compose a lot easier for us. So the first topic I'll cover is the Compose previews. Previews provide us visual feedback, which means that we can visualize how our UI components will look and behave without having to run the actual app in an emulator or on a physical device. Previews also allow us to have rapid iteration, meaning we can instantly see changes we make to our Compose components, and this can heavily speed up our development process. It also allows us to do isolated testing, meaning we can test individual components in isolation. And again, this can make development and debugging much easier for us. So how do we actually create previews? So previews are actually created using an annotation, and that's the app preview annotation that we put on a composable function. The preview annotation actually provides parameters as well, which can customize the behavior of the preview. And some of these parameters are name, device configuration, and there's other parameters as well. So on the screenshot on the right, we see that we have this function called default preview, and it has the app composable annotation, meaning it's a composable function. And now we can also see a preview of this composable by giving it that app preview annotation on the top. And this is why we have this preview on the right, where we can see the preview of this login screen. In this slide, I'm covering parameterized previews. So we can also pass data into previews to see how specific components will look with different data passed into it. So in this preview right here, we have a card and we pass in data about a specific basketball player. And I'll go more into detail how to do this once we dive into Android Studio a little later. But this is just a glimpse of how we do it. We pass in a class that will implement the preview parameter provider interface, and we provide that to the preview itself. We can also see multiple previews for the same composable. So you can create multiple previews for the same composable, and it will be showcasing the different states and different variations of that. So in this example, which we will dive into a little more later in detail, we are providing two basketball player objects to this composable or to this preview, and we are seeing a preview for both of these data sets. And we can also see a preview for the same composable in light mode and in dark mode. So we have two screens over here. On the left, we see the light mode preview, and on the right, we see the dark mode preview, and these are of the same composable. And how we accomplish this is by using the UI mode parameter of the preview annotation. So we see that there are actually two preview annotations here. The first one does not have UI mode set to anything, but by default, it's set to light mode, which is why we can see the light mode preview here. And the second one has UI mode set to night mode, and that allows us to see the dark mode preview on the right. So before diving into the layout inspector, I would like to dive into Android Studio and just show you some of the things we just spoke about. So here we are in Android Studio. And I just want to go over some of the things we spoke about in the presentation. So the first thing I want to show is an example of the actual preview annotation. So here we have a composable of a login screen. We annotated with that composable, and we also annotated with that preview. And this allows us to see the preview of this whole composable on the right side. I also wanted to show an example of the parameters in the preview. So here's an example of us passing in a parameter to a preview. So if I can just enlarge this a little bit, we see that we have this card, and we pass in this by passing parameters by use this annotation at preview parameter, and we're passing in this model configuration provider. And this is a class that will actually implement this interface called preview parameter provider. And inside this, we can actually provide values or a list of sequence for data. So over here, we're just providing one player object. And we can see when we go over here, now we can use that player object to actually populate this composable, populate the image, populate the name, populate the age, the weight, and so on. I also wanted to give you an example of how to show multiple previews for one composable. So over here, we have two composables, as I showed in the, actually one composable, but two different previews for the same composable with two different data sets. And in this example, we're passing in two player objects into the sequence. And then inside the preview, inside this actual composable function, this actually has two player data, and we're creating this card for both of those pieces of data. Let's see. Let's show an example of light mode and dark mode side by side. So we have, again, same composable, but two different previews. The top is for light mode. The bottom is for dark mode. We have two preview annotations. Again, the top one does not have the UI mode set to anything, but by default, it's set to light mode. And the bottom one has the UI mode set to night mode, which allows us to see the night mode preview. And now I'll be going back to the presentation, and let's talk about the layout inspector now. So now let's dive into the layout inspector. The layout inspector is basically a tool that allows developers to debug their layout, whether it's in Compose or without Compose. But in this presentation, we're going to be talking about how it relates to using Jetpack Compose specifically. So the layout inspector, again, allows developers to inspect Compose layout inside of a running app. This can be inside of an emulator or of a physical device. The layout inspector allows us to check how often a composable is recomposed or even skipped. And it helps us debug for performance in an app and helps us optimize the performance as well. There are actually three parts of a layout inspector. So one part is the component tree. The other part is the layout display itself. And the third part is the attributes. So the component tree allows us to see all the different composables inside of a layout and how the composables actually relate to each other, how they are nested in relation to one another, and so on. And we'll take a closer look at this once we dive into Android Studio a little later. The second part of the layout inspector is the layout display. And this is just a rendering of the app's layout as it appears exactly on your emulator or on your physical device. This image on the right may look a little weird, but this is just a 3D mode on. So there's a 2D mode and there's a 3D mode, which I'll get into a little later as well. And the third part of the layout inspector is the attributes. So each composable has attributes, and we can see all of these attributes in the attribute section. So for example, if you click on a text view, you can see all of the attributes or all of the properties of that text view, meaning you can see the text assigned to it, the text color, the width, the font style, background color, and so on. The layout inspector does allow live updates, meaning whenever you go to a different screen on your app or the UI on your app actually changes, the layout inspector will be automatically updated if you have live updates on. And if you want to enable live updates, you just simply select the live updates option in the layout inspector, and you can turn that on or off as you wish. The layout inspector also has a 3D mode, as I mentioned a little before. So in the screenshot, you see where I'm pointing with this arrow. There's a button. If you click on this button, it enables 3D mode. And this allows you to see the different layers of your UI and how the composables are stacked against each other. So before going further, actually, let's dive into Android Studio and see some of this stuff in Android Studio itself. So here we are in Android Studio. I'm going to run my sample app just to see. So here's my sample app. It's just a list of cards displaying NBA basketball player data. And I have the layout inspector open, but if you want to open it, there's this tab at the bottom right of Android Studio. And if you just click on it, you can see the layout inspector. And as we talked about earlier, on the left, we see the component tree. And this allows us to see all of the different components of our layout, all of the different composables, the cards, the images, the columns, and whatever else went into creating our layout. In the middle here, we have the actual layout display. And on the right, we have the different attributes that would be with basically the different properties of each of these composables. So if we click on, let's say, this card right here, we get to see the properties of that card. If we go into a text, we get to see the different properties of that text. So here's the live updates button. So if this is off, then this won't automatically be updated when our layout is updated. But if this is on, which it is now, this will automatically get updated whenever we change screens or update the UI in our actual app. This is the 3D mode button right here. So right now our app is in 2D mode, So we can only see it basically look like a regular screen. But if we turn this mode on, then we can kind of see like the different layers and how the components basically stack against each other. And this helps us when we're trying to debug an issue and we're not sure if one composable might be covered by another composable or why it's not displaying properly. And to turn that off, we just click on this button again. Now I'm going to just dive back into the slides to learn about the other concepts inside the layout inspector. We also have the So now let's talk about the reference image overlay. The layout inspector basically allows us to upload a design and compare it with our actual with the actual design we have in our app. So we can usually get a design from Figma or from something like Zeppelin, and then we can upload it to the layout inspector and compare side by side with the actual app screen and just see what's the overlap, what looks the same, what looks different, and what needs to be changed. The layout inspector also allows us to save snapshots of the layout inspector itself. So if we have a specific screen up and we want to save the snapshot of it, we can save it and share it with other developers or refer back to it later. This allows us to see the component tree, the actual layout display and also the attributes of all of those composables, if we ever need to refer to it later. And the last thing I want to talk about is the recomposition counts. The layout inspector tells us when a specific composable has been recomposed, and it gives us a number about like how many times exactly it's been recomposed. And it also shows us how many times a composable has been skipped in recomposition. And I'll show that a little later in Android Studio. And I won't get into this now, but I'll show an example of good recomposition and bad recomposition in Android Studio itself. So let's just dive into it right now. So we're back in Android Studio. Let's try to see an example of the reference image overlay. So again, over here we have our layout display. And over here we have this button called Load Overlay. So we can click on that, and we can try to load a Figma or a Zeppelin file from our computer. So I have this screenshot of another app, so I'm just going to use that as an example. So I can upload that, and now we see this design on top, and we can, and over here, if we switch this, we can see our actual app, and now we can see like how our app differs from the design. So now I'm seeing, okay, maybe there's a lot of things I need to improve or fix to make my app look more like the design. And again, this slider just allows us to increase or decrease the transparency of the reference image overlay. So this is a good feature just to if you really want to make sure your design looks exactly like the Figma or the Zeppelin designs. And to clear the reference image overlay, you just click on this button again, which will clear the overlay. And if you want to export your componentry, your layout display and attributes, and you want to share with another developer, there's this button right here. And if you hover over it, you can see that it says snapshot export or import. So I can click on that, and I can export the snapshot, and I can just give it a name, test snapshot. And then I can just save it to, let's say, my desktop. And now I can share that with whoever I want, or I can just reference it later when I need to. So now let's talk about how to see recomposition counts and recomposition skips in the layout inspector. So right here, I have some code that will show us a composable with abnormally high recomposition count. So let's run that. So let me just run that. So this is just a list. Every time we click this button on the list, another item will be added to this list. And over here, we have, again, the layout inspector. So if we go into this layout inspector and we see this list over here, so let's see what happens when we, okay, so this is actually the good item list. So we can see that every time we add an item to the list, we're not actually increasing the recomposition count of the list. But the reason that the button recomposition count is so high is because of the animation. So every time we click on this, the button is actually being recomposed many times because of the animation on it. But let me show an example with bad recomposition, actually. So if we do this, we run this, you can see how the list is recomposing every time we add an item to the list. So let's find the list in the component tree. Here's the list. And if we add an item to the list here, so let me make that a little bigger. If I add an item by clicking that button, we can see the whole list is being recomposed every time we add an item. And the reason for this is because in this bad item list, it actually takes in a list, but for each item in the list, we're just creating a text in a spacer inside of a column. But as we know, this isn't the correct way to actually make a list in Jetpack Compose, or show a list of items in Jetpack Compose. The correct way would be to do something like this, where we have a lazy column, and this lazy column creates an item object for each of these items in the list. So using this would lead to better performance and thus less recomposition counts. Yeah, so that wraps up my presentation on some tooling for Jetpack Compose. Again, we went over the preview and we went over the layout inspector. These are both tools that will help us developing apps in Android Jetpack Compose and make it easier, make it faster, and hopefully makes the app have better performance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minhazur Rahman, and we really hope that you feel better soon. And thank you all for joining us today. Again, just a reminder, we do a lightning talk every Thursday at 5:15 Eastern Time. And next time, one of my practice for iOS his name is Ilya. He's going to be talking about Xcode 15 potentials, specifically regarding the UI modifiers, where he's going to talk us through some tips and tricks where you can follow. So with that being said, thank you all for joining us again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.